Hey community, welcome back. And if this is your first time here, I'm Dr. Blaire, a doc in clinical psychology, and on this channel we discuss psychology, inspiration, social justice, and all topics in between. First things first, hit that subscribe and bell button. I need to see you back next week. And of course, stay tuned because we are going to start a new series for this month, and it is entitled Tackle. Stay tuned. All right, so before we tackle loneliness, remember the battlefield is a recurring series here where myself and or a community member will come on and discuss a battle that they are currently fighting and or have fought before. And the battlefield is the place that we release, reclaim, and reestablish our justice. Justice for our mind, body, soul, and even for our people. Now, we're not entering the battlefield, but we are going to tackle a few things that you may want to put onto the battlefield, that you may want to enter the battlefield for, and that is loneliness. And the reason that I landed on loneliness is it's this lingering reaction or even symptom that's related to a lot of different situations, experiences, grief and loss that many people are experiencing right now, including myself. And it's also attached to a lot of mental health concerns. And so because it's this ongoing concern or thing that we experience throughout life, many of us have experienced it in life, or as I mentioned, are currently experiencing it. I thought that we need to actually tackle it, because if we don't address loneliness, it can morph and turn into something more. So remember, we're wanting to live healthy lives, which means we have to be attentive, aware of the impact and influence that our emotional responses can have. So let's start with the basis of what exactly is loneliness, because a lot of people may see loneliness as a different thing. Here's my basis. Loneliness is this sad type of response, a sad emotional reaction in response to infrequent social interactions or activities. So that could be with friends, families, work, co-workers, so on and so forth. Infrequent social activities or interactions. And with that being said, we often hear loneliness come up when people are reporting symptoms that are related to anxiety and depression in the behavioral health world. And anxiety and depression, for many of you who don't know, it is the top two most common reported clinical concerns. And so many people, I won't give numbers, but many people have experienced clinical anxiety and or depression at some point in their life. And with that being said, loneliness may have been something that you felt during that time. Why? Because it's this feeling that I am the only one, I am alone, I am remote, I am set apart, I'm isolated, and now it's turned into something negative. And so let's break that down. When you are experiencing any form of anxiety, which is worry, excessive worry, or fear, you can start to feel like it's inwardly, you can start to feel like you're the only person who's feeling it to that level of intensity, and it starts to separate you or isolate you simply because of what you're feeling. Now, I have a lot of different theories of what that means in psychology, and also as a Christian, what that means. I won't get into that at this moment, but I want you to think about any type of current life experience that you're having right now, and is it bringing up any feelings of loneliness? If so, why? And as we start to think about that and break it down, you really want to start pulling apart what are the roots of making you feel lonely. Now, remember, just because you're around a bunch of people, just because you are physically around plenty of folks, does not mean that you do not feel isolated. It does not mean that you don't feel lonely. It does not mean that you don't feel alone in whatever particular area. What do I mean by this? You may be an entrepreneur, and you may be connected to plenty of other entrepreneurs. And although all of these entrepreneurs can feel very much so connected, they can relate to one another, but you may be the only entrepreneur that is opening up the type of business that you are opening up, or that is currently experiencing difficulties like securing funding, things of that nature. And that can bring up a feeling of loneliness and or that you are alone in the struggle that you're having. Now, reality is you're likely not the only person experiencing that, but that's not the point. Right now, you're having an emotional response, and emotionally, you're feeling like you're the only one. When you're feeling like that, and you start to feel like you're the only one, that you are set apart, and you're starting to feel very remote and isolated, the deeper you go into that, the more danger can come. Loneliness may also increase chances of feeling like there's a void that isn't being met. And then on a surface level, some people may say, well, look at the pure definition, then that is a void that isn't being met. I'm not going to have a debate right now about that because I have different perspectives. But instead, when a void is there, and I'm talking about a deeper void, then that doesn't necessarily have to be related to like loneliness. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. So let's not generalize here. But in the case that it is, and there's a deeper void that isn't being met, we really have to sit down and reflect on why is it that we feel like other people being there will help to fill that void. Explore that. And as you're exploring that on your own, you may get down to the root of what it is that you need to do in terms of a solution to address the loneliness. But let's take a step back to loneliness, because when you're sitting in loneliness and it is intensified, it often increases a lot of self-doubt. Remember, you're in isolation when you're feeling lonely. And when you're in isolation, you have a lot of time to sit with all of your thoughts and to sit with all of your feelings. And as you're sitting down, reflecting on all those thoughts and feelings that are likely negative, it has a tendency to kind of turn up the volume on self-doubt, questioning yourself, feeling like you don't belong, feeling like you are not connected to others. And when all of those feelings are swimming around, it then pairs back into what I mentioned earlier, feelings around anxiety and depression, which is oftentimes why we see a lot of lonely type of responses when people are experiencing clinical anxiety and depression. And I know people are like, well, how do I kind of get myself out of all of this? We're going to get to that soon. But more so, this is talking about some of the key things to pay attention to and how do you recognize it. When you are able to recognize it, then you're able to tackle it. I want to talk about two areas that are impacted in terms of physical conditions, one being high blood pressure and the other one being dementia. In isolation, or when you are deeper into feelings of loneliness for prolonged periods of time, it can start to reflect into your physical body. And there are studies that show that there's a direct correlation with high blood pressure as well as dementia. Now, I know some of y'all are thinking, oh, I've struggled with high blood pressure. Does that mean that I've struggled with loneliness? Not necessarily. I'm just saying that when people have had prolonged isolation, it shows that there's a correlation, and a lot of those participants in that study also experience some of these other areas. So when this prolonged feeling of isolation and you are living a remote life, again, I mentioned earlier, the deeper that you are into that, the dangerous it can become, the more dangerous it can become. And so dementia can actually start to set in as it has a direct correlation with some of the neurological mapping, so to speak, and which is really talking about our brain functioning. And our brain really impacts everything that we do. Our brain tells our hand to move up and move down, for the head to shake up and down, for you to say something. And when that brain isn't, when certain areas of our brain are not being worked, just like when we don't exercise certain areas of our body, the same thing happens to our brain. It starts to shut down, deteriorate, so on and so forth. And so there have been some studies that show that it is a correlation to dementia. I recommend that you all look into that a little bit more if you have more questions, because I don't want to get into that too deeply here. But tons of research to kind of back up what I just said. With that being said, these are two areas where physical complications can come up. I assure you there are more. As I mentioned, the further you go into loneliness and isolation, the more dangerous it can become. So let's quickly address isolation. Loneliness and isolation, very much so connected, right? Now, I mentioned that as a believer, a Christian believer, I have different perspectives. I want to push on this right now because in this current season, we have not come out of COVID. COVID is still here, but we have come out of the thick of the pandemic, where many of us were working from home. We were living in isolation. We all just came out of an experience where many of us experienced loneliness in some way, shape, or form, and people were just craving for human contact and interaction. So this topic should be very fresh for you. And if it is very fresh for you or even current for you, then you know what I mean. As a Christian believer, this is not the season for you to live in isolation. Now, we go to the Bible, we see that God actually called certain people to isolation for specific reasons. But I assure you, he did not keep them there the entire time. There are seasons, there are times to be in isolation, and there are times not to be in isolation. And this, for across the board, for many believers, I don't think that this is a time for us to be in isolation, particularly for a lot of things that God is doing on the earth right now. We need to be teamed up with one another and be in a place where we are being further equipped for many of the things that will be changing moving forward. So with that being said, this is not a time to be in isolation, as it not only has a lot of mental complications, implications or consequences. It has physical consequences. It has spiritual consequences. It has social consequences. So if you're going onto the battlefield to tackle loneliness and isolation, then I want you to do this keeping in mind of not only how do you recognize it, not only how do you pinpoint if this is going on for you, how it's impacting you, whether mentally and or physically, so on and so forth. But also remember that you have to be equipped going onto the battlefield and how to do it. So here are some quick solutions. Now I know y'all gonna look at me like, that's an easy solution. It is an easy solution. What? Come out of isolation. Loneliness is not just because you don't have social interaction. It is because you can be at a place where you're avoiding social interaction. So you have to actually engage in that level. So if you're living in a moment where you feel lonely and you are isolated, then you have to come out of isolation and start to engage. Now that can be anxiety provoking to have to come out and do something that you may have not done for a while, but it may be worth it. Why? Because all of the things that we just talked about. Come out of isolation. Point number one. Point number two, as I mentioned earlier, is address the origin of this feeling of loneliness. Address it, reflect on it, actually pinpoint, where does this come up? Where has it come from? Why does it come up so often for me? If you're able to pinpoint, then you're actually able to get to the root of it instead of tackling some of the tree branches, as I like to think of it as a tree. Don't tackle the tree branches. That's not enough. You got to get to the root of the tree. Loneliness may just be a branch. But let's start there since you've identified it and get down to the root of it. Now, don't feel pressure to have to do that all in one day, all in one setting. Allow yourself some time to unfold that. And as you start to peel back the layers, you'll get closer and closer and closer to the root. But the key is not to give up. And lastly, this is one for the believer. A lot of people don't know this or would be maybe have a difficult time actually saying this out their mouths, but there are times where we may feel lonely or isolated, set apart, remote from even God. And if you are a believer and you do feel that way, then you have to start to addressing what are some of the barriers, what are some of the roadblocks that are in front of you that are creating this level of blockage, and start removing it. I assure you, he's there. He wants to hear from you and wants to have a level of dialogue with you that doesn't feel like there's all of this blockage, walls, hardening hearts that are in the way from you being able to have that interaction. There's no reason as believers that we should feel isolated from him. And I often take the disposition that if that is the case, then it is from us, because I don't think I've ever experienced a time where God pulled away from me. He wants to be with his children. He wants to commune and cover his children. But that's up to us to, as in terms of our own choice, to do the same with him. He's not going to bully us. He's all about consent. And so if you are consenting to do that with him, then you have to be actively engaged in removing the barriers so that you're not in isolation with your relationship with God. So quick recap. Come out of isolation. Tackle loneliness by coming out of isolation. Actually addressing what is the origin of this, come out of isolation with people, with God, and get to the root of it. That is where I would like for you all to start, and that will actually reduce the likelihood of it spiraling into other mental health concerns and or physical health concerns, so on and so forth. Save the date, and I promised that y'all would not see the save the date again. So I like to keep my promises. Here is one of the official flyers of the battlefield. And the conference is going to be on November 5th here in Chicago. I will be posting on my social media, so please be sure that you are following me on Instagram and or Facebook so that you can get a lot of those details, the registration code, so on and so forth. I will be putting it in the description box when the time comes, but you have to be paying attention and you have to watch out for it. I want to make sure that you are there and that you have an opportunity to be a part of this, because we're going to take faith in our mental health principles and pair it together and actually learn how to use it. And as I said before, I'm expected to see you there. Like, comment, subscribe, and share. Share with your community, and be sure that you are sharing with someone who needs some tips on how they can tackle loneliness. And remember, before you go, and I see you next week, if I'm great and you're great, then we're a great community.